Have you ever considered what true silence sounds like? Not the absence of noise, but a presence all its own. A heavy blanket woven from falling snow and the deep, indifferent hum of a world that does not know your name. Anwe knew it now. It was the sound of her own blood slowing in her veins, the brittle crackle of ice forming on the frayed edges of her thin gray dress. The pines, heavy with their white burden, stood like silent judges over her pathetic crawl through the deepening drifts. Each breath was a shard of glass in her lungs, a desperate, failing protest against the cold that had already claimed her fingers and toes, turning them into numb, useless things. She had been running for 3 days, fueled by a terror that burned hotter than any fire, but even terror freezes. The image of Mr. Finch's face, a mask of pleasantries cracking to reveal the grasping greed beneath, was the last thing that had given her strength. He had promised safety, a new life away from the toil of the railroad camps. Instead, he had offered a gilded cage, and when she refused the key, he had simply left her on the edge of this vast white wilderness to be erased. The world was tilting, the stark contrast of black bark against white snow swirling into a dizzying vortex. Her thoughts, once sharp with fear, were becoming soft and slow, like molasses in winter. One final, ragged gasp, and the silence won. Her face met the snow, the cold a shocking, then soothing kiss. Darkness rushed in, a welcome relief. And then, through the closing curtain of her consciousness, a new element intruded upon the silence, a crunching, heavy, rhythmic footfalls that spoke of impossible size and strength, a sound that did not belong to the starving wolves or the panicked deer. A shadow, immense and solid, fell across her small form, blocking out the unforgiving gray sky. The world smelled of pine and leather and something else. Something warm and alive. Anwe woke to the sensation of being adrift in a sea of warmth, a feeling so alien and profound it felt like a dream. The first thing she registered was the low, rhythmic crackle of a fire, its orange light dancing on a ceiling of thick, dark logs. The air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, and drying herbs. She was lying on a bed of soft furs, a thick wool blanket tucked up to her chin. Her own gray dress, stiff with ice and mud, was gone, replaced by a large homespun linen shirt that smelled faintly of soap and the clean, sharp scent of pine. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to pierce the warm fog in her mind. Where was she? Whose clothes were these? She pushed herself up on her elbows, her muscles screaming in protest. The cabin was a single room, meticulously organized and starkly masculine. Tools hung from pegs on the wall, and a long table dominated the center of the room. And there, sitting at the table with his back to her, was a man. He was enormous, a mountain of a man whose shoulders seemed to block out half the light from the fire. His hair, a wild mane of dark brown streaked with gray, fell past his shoulders, and a thick, untamed beard covered the lower half of his face. He was sharpening a large knife with slow, deliberate strokes, the scrape of steel on stone the only sound besides the fire. He didn't seem to have noticed she was awake. Anwe froze, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was weak, trapped. This man, this giant, could crush her with one hand. He was the embodiment of the brutal wilderness she had just escaped, another monster in a world full of them. He stopped his work, setting the knife down with a soft click. Without turning, he spoke, his voice a low rumble like rocks shifting deep underground. "The broth is warm. You should eat." He gestured with his head toward a small wooden bowl steaming on the hearth. She didn't move. Couldn't. Fear had paralyzed her. He finally turned his head and she saw his eyes. They were a startlingly clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and held no malice, only a kind of weary patience. He was not Mr. Finch. He was something else entirely. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light that filtered through the single deerskin-covered window. Anwe existed in a state between sleeping and waking, the deep, bone-aching exhaustion of her ordeal slowly receding. The mountain man, whom she learned was named Olin, moved about the small cabin with a surprising, quiet grace for a man of his size. He was a creature of routine and silence. He would rise before the sun, stoke the fire, and leave a bowl of warm porridge or a piece of roasted rabbit for her before disappearing into the white world outside. He would return hours later, dusted with snow, carrying firewood or a fresh kill. He never pressed her to speak, never asked how she came to be half dead in his territory. He simply provided. He tended to the angry red flesh of her frostbitten fingers and feet, applying a salve of his own making that smelled of pine sap and something bitter. His hands, though calloused and huge, were impossibly gentle. Anwe watched him, her fear slowly being replaced by a profound curiosity. She had spent her life being small, overlooked, a ghost moving through the loud, brutal world of men who wanted something from her. Olin wanted nothing. He existed in his own orbit, as much a part of the mountain as the ancient pines or the granite cliffs. One afternoon, as a blizzard howled outside, sealing them in their warm refuge, he sat by the fire, mending a tear in a leather pouch. Anwe, feeling a flicker of strength return, sat up. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. Olin didn't look up from his work, but he paused, the needle held mid-stitch. He gave a slight nod, a barely perceptible acknowledgement. For saving me," she added, the words feeling small and inadequate. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers for a long moment. The silence stretched, filled only by the screaming wind. "The mountain tries to kill what is weak," he said, his voice a low burr, "but it respects what endures." He returned to his sewing. The conversation, such as it was, concluded. It was the most he had ever said to her, and in those few words she understood. He hadn't saved her out of pity. He had saved her because she had, against all odds, endured long enough for him to find her. When the sun finally broke through after the long storm, it cast the world in a blinding, brilliant white. Anwe felt a restlessness she hadn't experienced in years. The warmth of the cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. She bundled herself in the layers of borrowed clothes and furs Olin had given her and stepped outside. She expected him to send her back inside. 100 million. She expected him to send her back inside, back to the safety of the fire. Instead, he beckoned her over with a slight tilt of his head. She walked carefully, her feet still tender, and stood beside him. He pointed a large, gloved finger at the depressions in the snow. "Elk," he said. Just the one word. He then pointed to a different, smaller set of tracks crossing the first. "Coyote." He began to walk, following the coyote trail, and looked back to see if she was following. She was. For the next hour he gave her a silent lesson in the language of the forest. He showed her how a bent twig indicated the direction a deer had fled. He crumbled a piece of scat between his fingers, explaining through gestures that it was fresh, the predator still near. He led her to a thicket of bushes with shriveled dark berries clinging to the branches. He picked one, crushed it, and then pointed to a nearby pile of bones, small and delicate, from a bird. The meaning was clear. Poison. Then he took her to another bush, this one with bright red berries, and popped one into his own mouth before offering one to her. It was tart and tasted of winter, but it was sustenance. He was teaching her to see the world as he did, not as a terrifying void, but as a complex tapestry of signs and secrets, a place that provided for those who knew how to read it. "Live in towns, they think they own the live-in towns, they think they own the land," he rumbled, more to the mountains than to her. "They build fences to own a piece of it. But the mountain, she owns you. You don't survive by fighting her. You survive by listening. Their quiet rhythm was shattered a week later. They were on a high ridge checking Olin's trap lines when he suddenly froze, his body going utterly still. He held up a hand and Anwe stopped behind him, her heart immediately beginning to hammer against her ribs. He crouched, pulling her down with him behind a rocky outcropping. He pointed, and she followed his gaze. Far below, winding through the valley pass, were 4 riders. They were just dark specks against the snow, but even from this distance their intent felt predatory. They moved with the grim purpose of hunters, their eyes scanning the landscape. One of them wore a long dark coat and a hat that Anwe recognized with a sickening lurch of her stomach. It was Mr. Finch, and he had brought his men. The cold that seeped into her bones had nothing to do with the winter air. It was the icy dread of being found, of being dragged back to the life she had nearly died to escape. How could they have tracked her this far? Olin glanced at her, his gray eyes narrowed. He saw the recognition and terror on her face, and his own expression hardened into something formidable, like granite. He didn't need an explanation. The men were hunting, and she was the prey. All the safety she had felt, all the fragile peace she had found in this remote wilderness, evaporated like mist in the sun. The mountain was no longer a sanctuary. It was a hunting ground, and they were trapped. "We have to go." Olin's voice was a low, urgent command. He was already moving, his large frame surprisingly agile as he retreated from the ridge, keeping low to the ground. Anwe scrambled after him, her mind reeling. Finch wouldn't give up. He saw her not as a person, but as a possession, an investment that had run away. His pride was at stake. He would tear this entire mountain apart to find her. As they slipped back into the dense cover of the pines, Anwe looked over her shoulder one last time at the dark figures below. They were her past, a relentless stain on the clean, white snow, and they were coming for her. This journey, she realized, had only just begun. Have you ever wondered what you're capable of when everything is on the line? If this story of survival and unexpected alliances resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. There was no time for deliberation. Back at the cabin, Olin moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. He was not panicked, but infused with a cold, clear purpose. While Anwe watched, her hands trembling, he gathered what was essential: a bedroll of thick furs, a leather pouch of dried meat and berries, his sharp knife, a tinder box, and a coil of rope. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "The things you wore, they are dry now. Put them on, under the furs. Leave nothing else." He was erasing them, leaving the cabin as a silent, empty shell. She numbly dressed in the layers he indicated, her borrowed shirt and trousers underneath the heavy hides. The cabin, which had been her entire world, her recovery and her rebirth, was now just a place they were leaving, a place that would soon be found by him. Olin kicked snow over their tracks near the door, a futile but necessary gesture. Then he led her not down the mountain, but up, toward the higher, more treacherous peaks where the snow lay deeper and the wind cut like a razor. It was a brutal, punishing climb. The air grew thin and bit at any exposed skin. His boots made in the snow, and forced herself to keep moving. He was a different man now. The quiet, patient protector had been replaced by a grim, strategic guide. He paused every so often, not to rest, but to listen, his head cocked, tasting the wind, reading the subtle shifts in the environment. He was part of this place, and it spoke to him in a language she was only beginning to understand. They moved through dense thickets of pine that scraped at their clothes and skin, and across exposed ridges where the wind threatened to tear them from the mountainside. Twice they heard the faint crack of a gunshot echo up from the valley below, a sound that made Anwe flinch and sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through her. Finch's men were searching, firing their guns to signal each other, confident in their pursuit. They saw them as city men would, a giant and a girl, easy to corner, easy to break. But Olin was not a city man. He was the mountain's son. He was leading them into a world where their guns and their confidence meant nothing. They traveled for 2 days, the pursuit a constant unseen pressure at their backs. They slept for short, freezing hours, huddled together for warmth in the lee of snow-covered boulders, and ate handfuls of dried meat on the move. Anwe was pushed beyond every limit she thought she had. The physical agony was immense, but something inside her was changing. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut, but it was now overlaid with a layer of hardened resolve. She was no longer just fleeing, she was actively surviving. Olin pointed out a patch of disturbed snow, the distant cry of a hawk, that told them they were still ahead of their pursuers. On the 3rd day, as the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the snow, they came to the edge of a hidden canyon. Nestled within it, protected from the worst of the winds, was a small, sheltered encampment. Smoke curled from the tops of several hide lodges, and the scent of roasting meat hung in the air. This was where Olin had been leading them. As they approached, 2 men with long braids and carrying bows emerged from the trees, their faces stern and questioning. They looked at Olin, then their dark eyes fell on Anwe, a stranger, a clear outsider. Olin spoke to them in a language Anwe didn't understand, his voice low and respectful. It was a series of guttural sounds and soft consonants that seemed to mimic the sounds of the wilderness itself. He gestured back the way they had come, then to her, his meaning clear even without the words. They were being hunted. The men listened, their expressions unreadable. Finally, one of them nodded and led them into the camp. People emerged from the lodges, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They were the Ute, the people of the shining mountains. An old woman with a face like a beautiful weathered map came forward. She looked Anwe up and down, her gaze missing nothing, the fear in her eyes, the exhaustion in her posture, the foreign cut of her features. Olin said something to the woman, and she nodded slowly. She took Anwe's arm with a surprising strength and led her toward one of the lodges. Inside, it was warm and smelled of sage and wood smoke. The woman gave her a bowl of hot, savory stew. As Anwe ate, the warmth spreading through her, she watched Olin talking with the Ute warriors. He was not a stranger here. He was respected, an ally. He stood among them, his massive frame a symbol of strength, and she saw him in a new light. He was not just a hermit, but a bridge between worlds. Later that evening he came to the lodge. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and a small, almost imperceptible softness entered his eyes. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. The touch was brief, feather-light, but it sent a shock of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a silent acknowledgment of all they had endured together, a promise of protection that went deeper than words. The respite was short-lived. A scout returned the next afternoon with news. Finch's men had found their trail leading toward the canyon. They were 2, maybe 3 hours away. A council was held among the Ute elders and warriors, with Olin sitting among them as an equal. Anwe was brought to sit by the fire, to tell her story. With Olin translating her halting English into the Ute tongue, she spoke of Mr. Finch, of his false promises and his possessive cruelty. She spoke not as a victim, but as a witness. As she talked, she saw the expressions on the faces around her shift from suspicion to a grim understanding. They knew men like Finch. They had seen his kind of greed carve up the land and poison the rivers. Her fight, they realized, was a version of their own. When she finished, a respected elder named Many Wolves spoke. "The man who hunts a person like a deer has no honor. He is a sickness on the mountain." The decision was unanimous. They would not run. They would make a stand. The camp transformed into a whirlwind of quiet, purposeful activity. It was not the panicked preparation for a battle, but the calm, methodical work of masters of their craft. Warriors checked their bows and sharpened their arrows. Traps were prepared. Onway felt a desperate need to contribute, to be more than the frightened woman they were protecting. She watched them, her senses sharp, her mind racing. She recalled the things Olin had taught her, the details of the landscape they had just traversed. She remembered a narrow pass, flanked by steep, snow-laden cliffs. "There is a place," she said to Olin, her voice quiet but firm. "A passage through the rocks, before the canyon entrance. The snow on the cliffs above, it is heavy, unstable." Olin listened intently, his gray eyes fixed on her. He saw the spark of an idea, the strategist that had been awakened in her. He took her to Many Wolves, and she explained her observation. The old warrior listened, his weathered face thoughtful. He looked at Onway, then at Olin, and a slow smile touched his lips. He saw it too. She was not just the reason for the fight. She was now part of the plan. The prey was learning the ways of the predator. She was no longer just running from her past. She was setting a trap for it. The trap was set. The Ute warriors, moving like ghosts through the snow-dusted pines, took their positions. Olin was with them, not with a bow, but with his immense strength and knowledge of the terrain. He was to be the final, unmovable obstacle. Onway's role was different. She was the bait. Guided by a young warrior, she was taken to a position visible from the narrow pass she had identified. Her job was simple: be seen. Let Finch think he had his prize cornered. The wait was agonizing. The cold seeped into her bones, but she barely noticed. Her entire being was focused on the entrance to the pass. Then she saw them. Finch and his 3 men, riding with an arrogant confidence, their dark forms stark against the snow. Finch was in the lead, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. When he saw her, a triumphant sneer twisted his lips. "There you are," his voice carried on the still cold air, dripping with possessive victory. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" He and his men urged their horses forward into the pass. This was the moment. Onway took a deep breath and screamed. It was not a scream of fear, but a raw, piercing cry of defiance. It was the signal. High above, on the cliffs overlooking the pass, the Ute warriors let out a thunderous war cry. It was followed by a deep, rumbling groan. The snow on the cliffs, disturbed by precisely placed charges, began to shift. A small trickle became a cascade, and then the entire mountain seemed to let go. A roaring avalanche of snow, ice, and rock poured down into the pass, cutting off Finch's escape and separating him and one of his men from the other 2. Chaos erupted. The horses panicked. The 2 men at the rear were swept away, disappearing into the white torrent. Finch and his remaining man were thrown from their mounts, trapped. Before they could recover, the Ute warriors descended, their arrows flying with deadly accuracy. The last man went down with a cry. Finch, scrambling for his pistol, found his way blocked by Olin, who seemed to rise from the snow itself, a silent, implacable giant. Finch froze, his arrogance finally cracking. But it wasn't Olin who approached him first. It was Onway. She walked toward him, her steps steady, her chin high. The fear was gone, burned away and replaced by a cold, hard strength. She stopped a few feet from him, meeting his stunned gaze. "You do not own me," she said, her voice clear and steady, echoing in the sudden silence. "You do not own this mountain. You own nothing." Finch stared at her, his face a mess of disbelief and fury. He saw not the timid girl he had tried to control, but a woman he no longer recognized, forged into something new by the very wilderness he had left her to die in. He raised his pistol, his hand shaking, but before he could aim, Olin's massive hand closed around his wrist. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud in the quiet canyon. The pistol clattered onto the snow. Finch crumpled, cradling his broken arm, his face pale with pain and shock. The Ute warriors gathered him, his power gone, his threat neutralized. Justice on the mountain was swift and final. He and his men's weapons were taken, and they were given a single horse and sent back down the mountain, broken and defeated, with a clear warning never to return. Their survival was now in the hands of the winner they had so arrogantly underestimated. As they disappeared from view, a profound quiet settled over the canyon. The immediate danger had passed, leaving a strange, hollow echo in its wake. Anwe stood looking at the path of the avalanche, the raw, destructive power that she had helped unleash. She had faced her monster and had not flinched. The Ute people gathered around her, no longer with suspicion, but with a deep, earned respect. Many wolves placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have the heart of a hunter," he said, the highest compliment he could offer. "You have a place here, if you choose it." Anwe looked at the warm, welcoming light of the lodges, at the community that had fought for her, and felt a pull of belonging she had never known. But then she looked at Olin. He was standing apart, watching her, his gray eyes filled with a quiet intensity. He had been her rescuer, her teacher, her guardian. But in that final confrontation, they had become something more. Partners. He had trusted her instinct, her plan. He had seen the strength in her, not just the vulnerability. She walked over to him, the snow crunching under her feet. The vast, silent wilderness stretched out before them, its peaks glowing in the fading light. It was no longer a place of terror, but of breathtaking, untamed beauty. "What will you do now, Anwe?" Olin asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She looked from the Ute camp to the endless mountains, and then back to his face. She had been offered a community, a home. But her home was not a place. It was a feeling of safety, of being truly seen. It was him. "I think," she said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, "I will learn to listen to the mountain." He nodded slowly, and the corner of his own mouth lifted in a rare, small smile that transformed his rugged face. He reached out, not to touch her hair, but to take her hand, his large fingers gently enveloping hers. It was a simple gesture, but it was a promise, a beginning. Together, they turned to face the vast, wild horizon, two solitary figures who had found in each other a world of their own. But the whispers from the towns below are carried on the wind, and men like Finch have long memories. Their story on the mountain is far from over.